do you think like truth is relative or absolute? Like based on your own perception, or is there like a universal absolute truth out there?
It's a balance.
Okay.
On the atheistic view, certain actions such as incest and rape are not biologically and socially advantageous. And so in the course of human development, they have become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to show that rape or incest is morally wrong. Such behavior goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. If, as Kurtz states, the moral principles that govern our behavior are rooted in habit and custom, in feeling and fashion, then the rapist who goes against the herd morality is doing nothing more serious than acting unfashionably. The moral equivalent of Lady Gaga, if you will.
People are really trying to figure out, and a lot of people suggest that it is a cultural understanding of truth. You know, if you live somewhere else, you wouldn't say that, you know, stealing or killing or whatever, you know, your view of life is wrong because it's your view of life, and that could be true. So you're thrown in a chaotic bowl of truth and my truth and your truth and his truth, her truth, all this truth, you know, that people can make up for themselves. And you know, you destroy yourself. You destroy your idea of life.
Now, the atheist has a very important starting point. He begins with what is called, he or she begins with a truism, a moral truism, something on which we are generally agreed. To say, for example, that torture is wrong, racism is wrong, discrimination is wrong. Now, these things are self-evident truths. And so they say, because we believe in these truisms, they themselves can form the basis of morality. So you do not have to invoke a being called God, whom you put as the basis of morality. So truisms themselves can be the basis of morality. The problem with truism is this: how does the truism itself come to be recognized as a basis for morality is something that is not investigated by atheists. And then you have these amazingly cruel examples of people whose conduct militated against these very truisms.
The challenge confronting the non-theist who wants to continue to cling to objective moral values and duties after letting go of God is threefold. First, to explain what is the basis for objective moral values on atheism. In particular, what is the basis for the intrinsic value of human beings? Second, to explain what is the source of moral obligation and objective moral duties on atheism. What makes certain acts obligatory or forbidden if there is no moral lawgiver to command or forbid them? Thirdly, to explain how atheism can accommodate moral accountability, or alternatively, to explain why moral accountability is not necessary to morality.
Okay, so do you think it's relative or absolute? Like, do you think there's absolute truth out there, or is it based on truth, based on perception? What do you think about that?
I think for the most part, it's based on perception because there's a lot of different ways to look at things, and for different people, there's different truths. You might look at one thing and it might make you feel one way, but somebody else who's gone through something else might feel a whole other way about it. So, yeah.
Michael Roos himself states, and I quote, "The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. By the same token, love, generosity, tolerance, self-sacrifice are really good. And people who fail to see this are just morally handicapped. And there's no reason to allow their impaired vision to call into question what we see clearly. Thus, the existence of objective moral values serves to demonstrate the existence of God."
Your atheist friends say there is no God. Okay, I understand that. That's what you believe. But if you really believe that, then please don't get so upset about evil. Realize that if there is no God, good and evil are relative, just the creation of different human beings' minds. And so the Nazi has his definition of good and evil, the white South African has his definition of good and evil, the mass murderer has his definition of good and evil, Mother Teresa has her definition of good and evil. Nobody's right, nobody's wrong. It's all relative.
Now, our understanding of truth could be relative. But again, it goes back to what's the basis on which you're building upon, that foundation you're building upon. And that is where truth lies.
If God does not exist, it becomes impossible to condemn war, crime, or oppression as evil. Nor can one praise brotherhood, equality, or love as good. It does not matter what values you choose. There is no right and wrong. There is no good and evil. Now think of what that means. That means that an atrocity like the Holocaust was really morally indifferent. You may think that it was wrong, but the Nazi perpetrators who carried it out thought that it was good. In his book, Morality After Auschwitz, Peter Haas asks how an entire society could have willingly participated in a state-sponsored campaign of mass torture and genocide for over a decade without any serious opposition. He argues that, and I quote, "Far from being contemptuous of ethics, the perpetrators acted in strict conformity with an ethic which held that however difficult and unpleasant the task might have been, mass extermination of the Jews and Gypsies was entirely justified. The Holocaust, as a sustained effort, was possible only because a new ethic was in place that did not define the arrest and deportation of Jews as wrong, and in fact defined it as ethically tolerable and even good." Moreover, Haas points out, because of its coherence and internal consistency, the Nazi ethic could not be discredited from within. Only from a transcendent vantage point, which stands outside the relativistic socio-cultural mores, could such a critique be launched. But in the absence of God, it is precisely such a transcendent vantage point which we lack. One rabbi who was imprisoned at Auschwitz said it was as though a world existed in which all of the 10 Commandments were reversed. Thou shalt kill, thou shalt lie, thou shalt steal. Mankind has never seen such a hell. And yet, in a real sense, if God does not exist, then our world is Auschwitz. There is no good and evil. Right and wrong do not exist. Objective moral values and duties are illusory.
You know, to say that that's wrong, then that's saying that that's an absolute truth, that what he did was wrong, even though someone can say that, you know, based on his perspective, what he did was right, which is absurd. And if someone who thinks that is sick and disgusting, you know, to think that exterminating people is something that's right. Slavery, you know, all these injustices that we know that are injustice, yet people still flirt with the idea of relative truth, which can be. And if there is objective truth, it points to someone who, again, created these truths within us for us to know that what we do, we're held accountable to these things to a higher standard.
Friedrich Nietzsche, the great 19th century atheist who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the advent of nihilism. That is to say, the destruction of all meaning and value in life. I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was right.